There. Now that we're live streaming again, there's a whole lot of things that I have to try and remember to do. One of which I just did, but which I can see that I completely forgot to do last week. And that is that since I play the piano earlier, and the piano is rather loud compared to my speaking, I do have to turn the volume down or it'll end up being a little distorted. And last week I turned it down for the piano and then never turned it down for me to do the talking. So probably my speaking volume was a little bit low last week. The other thing I have to do is start the recording to be posted on YouTube. And going to discuss that in a moment. Get my wife called so she can be a part of what we do. And switch some things around hither, thither, and yon. So we've got all that done now. This is our Friday night Bible study, and it is for Friday, May 9th, 2025. Wow, second week in May already. Cinco de Mayo was that Tuesday? I believe so. Anyway, so that was something celebrated this week. Um, I didn't comment on this shirt last week. This is a new shirt. I bought it less than 2 weeks ago, and it kind of looks all wrinkly, and I think that's just the nature of the fabric. I spent nearly an hour a week ago today with the iron trying to flatten it out, but I don't think I made a whole lot of difference. Anyway, I was thinking as I was doing that it might be about the time of year to switch over from my long sleeve shirts to my short sleeve shirts, because what I do, I have all the shirts that I'm not using in the back of the closet, and when it's time to change, I take all the one out, put it in the back, and take the ones from the back and put it in the front of the closet so I start using those. Well, actually it turned out to be relatively sensible that I didn't, because sometime last week, I think it was, I turned the air conditioning system from cool to heat, and it stayed on heat until yesterday. And yesterday evening it actually got up to, I think, 78. My cool setting is 75, so I switched it over to cool. I was actually getting a little sweaty in the house. Well, that was why. It actually warmed up beyond what I'm used to. So now, I mentioned that I do record this and post the video on YouTube. And of course, now that Facebook has made its changes and live videos like this only remain in the group for 30 days, then the permanent home for these videos will be on YouTube. Now, some people might ask, why don't I do all the things that most YouTubers do, like ask you to comment, ask you to subscribe, ask you to hit the like button, all those kinds of things that a lot of YouTubers do in order to trigger YouTube's algorithms to get their videos promoted and visible on other people's feeds. And there's actually a reason that I don't do that. First of all, this is not primarily a YouTube event. This is an event on my wife's Facebook group, In Vain Do They Worship Me. The YouTube is just a place to also put these things and maybe reach an audience that wouldn't show up on Facebook. All these things that these YouTubers ask you to do are ways to promote themselves. But I view it as not just promoting yourself, which in itself I think is a bit problematic, but also to an extent trying to coerce you to do something without giving you the full right to choose to do such a thing on your own. And that's one of the key fundamental principles that we advocate in this group, is the fundamental and absolute freedom that God has granted to every individual. And we teach that any system, be it government or commerce or religion or else, that seeks to control you is standing outside of God's plan for life. God didn't intend us to be controlled by others. He intended us to be self-controlled and therefore to be free. And in the New Testament, you'll find quite a bit of discussion about the freedom that we have in Christ. I think in one place, Paul even talks about how certain people came to where he was to spy out the freedom that we have in Christ. So, yeah, for that reason, then, I choose not to try and promote myself through YouTube and through the standard tools that YouTube provides for self-promotion.
Can I add to that?
You may.
I see YouTube as a place where people open up a YouTube channel and try to promote whatever they're doing as a means for you to send them money.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of send us money going on YouTube. That's true.
I am totally against selling a relationship with Jesus. You should not have to use your credit card in order to get to know Jesus.
No.
We will never ask for money here on my YouTube page.
Right.
Where are we?
On your Facebook page.
You know, we'll never ask you for money here on Facebook. At least not for us.
Well, we don't ask for it on the YouTube channel either, and we don't get enough views for it to be monetized. So
we don't ask for it on the website either.
Right.
Strictly paid for out of my Social Security.
Yeah. We want people to join and listen to what we have to say, not because we've put razzle dazzle into it or smoke and mirrors or however you'd like to think of whatever we might put up in order to convince people to watch us. We want people to come to us because they thirst for a knowledge of the true God, and they want to know more about what He's really like, as can be known to us if we'll open our minds to that.
Yeah, and I tend to hold a grudge and tend to be snarky over having been brainwashed by the church for such a long period of time.
But I hope people understand that we don't teach that church membership is wrong if that's what you choose to do. But we want you to understand that if said church violates your freedom too much, it is not going against God to sever your relationship with that group.
Which is what I have done.
Right. Now, last week, we spent a little time in our leading up to the actual study talking about the levels of moral development. And I don't think I stated that one of the ways to understand the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, which people have come up with a lot of ways to explain that. One of the ways is to understand these principles of the various levels of moral development, and then to understand that God approaches his people at the level they are prepared to receive him. He wants to have a relationship with his people, and that may mean that he has to approach them in ways that aren't entirely compatible with his character, because that's what they are able to understand and relate to. If you buy into this, then God, the creator, the maker of all things, obviously would be at the very highest moral level, that these moral levels are both developmental, and then, of course, because we're broken humans, very often humans do not progress through all those developmental levels and end up spending their lives at a stunted level of moral development. Therefore, God is beyond all of us in those stages of moral development, and so he has to cloak himself, so to speak, so that we can comprehend him at our current level of moral development. And when you look at the Israelite people coming out of slavery in Egypt, they didn't have any liberty. They were told what to do in every aspect of their lives. And so they were at the very earliest stages of moral development as they left Egypt, and as Moses began to try to turn them into a cohesive nation. And for that reason, the approaches to God specified in the books of Moses, in the laws that are recorded there, are founded on those very primitive stages of moral development. And as you read through the history of the Old Testament, then you see God always approaching his people from one stage beyond the stage that they are at, encouraging them to move to that stage. And then when they do reach that stage, then God steps back one more to a place where they can still understand him, even though it's not where he really is. And then he encourages them, and through admonition seeks to get them to come up to another level. And so then when we get into the New Testament, the people have advanced a level or two perhaps, and now God is trying to reach his people to the next stage up. So then the question becomes, well, in our day, yes, we know there are people who are stuck at the very lowest pre-conventional stages of moral development. The bulk of society is stuck in the conventional stages of moral development. We understand it, but that's why Mr. Kohlberg called them conventional, because that's where most everybody is. And yet God would be post-conventional. So even today, he's calling us to step forward and ahead from where society is, our worldliness, if you wish to think of it that way, to come closer to where he is, so that we can have a more meaningful relationship with him. So, I think having said all that and mentioned the weather and other odds and ends, it's a good time for us to go ahead and bow our heads and get started on tonight's study. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings to us, and we thank you for the promise of your Holy Spirit. We want to feel that presence as we study the Word this evening. We want to come closer to you. We want to be available to the prompting of your Spirit, so that you can continue to draw us closer to you through our stages of development, until we have been transformed into your image. We ask this as we study tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. So, last week we read the story, we closed with the very odd story of the man of God from Judah and the condemnation of the worship system established by Jeroboam. And the writers are pretty explicit that they believed that what Jeroboam did was motivated by fear, namely his fear that if the people went to Jerusalem to worship, they would decide, hey, why did we quit David's family? We'd like to go back to serving David. And he was afraid that if they did that, that in order to facilitate that move back to unity with the southern kingdom of Judah, they would kill him. And so he established these golden calves at two places in the northern kingdom. And we will find out as we read through 1st and 2nd Kings that no king of Israel, well, some were worse and some were better, but no king of Israel throughout the entire history of the nation from here to their captivity by Assyria ever abandoned those golden calves. Now the man of God from Judah came to condemn the use of those, and the writers attribute to him a prophecy that a king named Josiah would burn human bones on those altars. Of course, that was long after the northern kingdom had gone away captive to Assyria and to the nations where the Assyrians took them, but it would in fact happen. And then, of course, there was the incident with the king saying, wait a minute, who are you? I'm the king. You're some nobody from another country. You don't belong here. And raised his hand toward him to say, get out of here. Guards, take this man away. You know, calling on security, so to speak. And his hand got paralyzed and stuck in that condition. And then he had some level of repentance, not very much, obviously, and asked the man of God to pray for him to restore his hand. And the man of God went along with that, and the king's hand was restored. And then we read the story of the old prophet. And we kind of took the position that the old prophet was acting on his own out of a sense that he felt the man of God from Judah should have made a bolder statement about the altars that Jeroboam had erected, and that by healing the king's hand, he had somehow diluted his message. And so this man acted to trip this man of God up and get him in trouble, and it worked. Even though this prophet lied to the man of God in order to get him in trouble. And again, for the most part, the authors of these tales tell us what happened, but they don't tell us why. They don't tell us all the motives. We're kind of left to figure that out for ourselves. So at any rate, now we've reached 1 Kings chapter 14, and we're reading in the New Living Translation as usual. At that time, Jeroboam's son Abijah became very sick. Now, I wonder why he has named his son Abijah. I think we're about to find out. So Jeroboam told his wife, disguise yourself so that no one will recognize you as my wife. Then go to the prophet Ahijah at Shiloh, the man who told me I would become king. And we read that story probably 2 weeks ago as we were reading the narrative about King Solomon, and how Ahijah wore a new cloak, and when he met Jeroboam, he took the cloak, tore it in 12 pieces, gave 10 of them to Jeroboam, and told him, "You're going to get 10 tribes, and the house of David will be left with 2." So at any rate, now he sends his wife to talk to this man who he apparently views as a potential ally. But he doesn't want this prophet to know who's coming to him. So he says to his wife, "Disguise yourself. And take him a gift of 10 loaves of bread, some cakes, and a jar of honey, and ask him what will happen to the boy." So Jeroboam's wife went to Ahijah's home at Shiloh. He was an old man now and could no longer see. But the Lord had told Ahijah, "Jeroboam's wife will come here pretending to be someone else. She will ask you about her son, for he is very sick. Give her the answer I give you." Well, that's a pretty typical message from God to a prophet. Tell him what's going to happen. I want you to say what I tell you to say. So when Ahijah heard her footsteps at the door, he called out, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why are you pretending to be someone else?" And then he told her, "I have bad news for you. Give your husband Jeroboam this message from the Lord, the God of Israel. I promoted you from the ranks of the common people and made you ruler over my people Israel. I ripped the kingdom away from the family of David and gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David, who obeyed my commands and followed me with all his heart and always did whatever I wanted. You have done more evil than all who lived before you. You have made other gods for yourself and have made me furious with your gold calves. And since you have turned your back on me, I will bring disaster on your dynasty and will destroy every one of your male descendants, slave and free alike, anywhere in Israel. I will burn up your royal dynasty as one burns up trash until it is all gone. The members of Jeroboam's family who die in the city will be eaten by dogs, and those who die in the field will be eaten by vultures. I, Yahweh, have spoken." Now again, this report from the prophet doesn't sound much like the God we know. It sounds like he's being vindictive. He's saying, "You've pissed me off. Here's the nasty things I'm going to do to you because you pissed me off." But if, again, we understand this in the light of those stages of moral development, God is approaching Jeroboam from a level that Jeroboam, in his stunted state, can comprehend and understand. So God's not really speaking the truth about himself, although he does speak the truth about the consequences to Jeroboam and his family for as a result of the actions that he's taken, the natural results of the choices that he's made. And so it sounds like God saying, "I'm going to do terrible things to you," but it's simply God approaching Jeroboam at a level Jeroboam can comprehend in order to understand what's happening to him. And then Ahijah said to Jeroboam's wife, "Go on home, and when you enter the city, the boy will die, the child will die. All Israel will mourn for him and bury him. He is the only member of your family who will have a proper burial. For this child is the only good thing that the Lord, the God of Israel, sees in the entire family of Jeroboam." Now, that kind of sounds like a very backhanded compliment. This is a good child, so I'm going to kill him just so he can be properly buried because he's the only one that's going to get a proper burial. Uh, yeah. God seen from the viewpoint of people who are at a very early stage of moral development. In addition, the Lord will raise up a king over Israel who will destroy.
That sounds like the husband who's beating his wife and telling her, I'm only doing this because I love you.
Right, yeah.
Or vice versa, the wife beating the husband.
Yeah.
It does happen.
Or this terrible thing happened to me because of my choice, but it's all your fault. I'm going to blame it on you.
Or the parent beating the child.
Yeah. This is for your own good.
Yeah.
Yeah. In addition, the Lord will raise up a king over Israel who will destroy the family of Jeroboam. This will happen today, even now. Then the Lord will shake Israel like a reed whipped about in a stream. He will uproot the people of Israel from this good land that he gave their ancestors, and will scatter them beyond the river. They translate it the Euphrates River, but the Hebrew will almost certainly just say the river. For they have angered the Lord with the Asherah poles they have set up for worship. He will abandon Israel because Jeroboam sinned and made Israel sin along with him. So Jeroboam's wife returned to Tirzah, and the child died just as she walked through the door of her home. And all Israel buried him and mourned for him, as the Lord had promised through the prophet Ahijah. The rest of the events in Jeroboam's reign, including all his wars and how he ruled, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. Jeroboam reigned in Israel 22 years. When Jeroboam died, his son Nadab became the next king. Meanwhile, yes?
I have taken the stand that God is the giver of life, not the taker.
Yes.
When God said that the child will die, was God saying, I'm going to kill the child? Or was he saying, this is the natural result? Or was he saying, the child's going to die and somebody's going to do it at this point?
Well, is God perhaps speaking from his position of omniscience, being all-knowing, being able to see the future? So he knows what will happen and when it will happen. And so he releases a limited part of that information to the prophet to pass on to the king's wife, so that when it comes true, people will know this is the Creator who has spoken.
That's my point. Yet we've been taught that God was the one that killed the child.
Well, I'm not going to buy that idea.
Story of being up in the airplane and you see two cars heading for each other on a one-way road, and you know that at some point they're going to crash. Now, when they crash, were you the one that caused the crash?
No, you just could see something that the drivers couldn't see.
So if you're holding a pencil in your hand and you say, if I drop this pencil, if I let go of the pencil, it's going to fall to the floor, are you the one that made it fall to the floor? Or was it the natural result of letting go of the pencil?
Yeah.
See, I have a hard time believing that God killed the child.
Or Are you
Taker.
are you a mystical seer when you predict that dropping this pencil will cause it to fall to the floor?
No,
I don't
because
think anybody would say that. We've all dropped pencils and we've all seen them fall to the floor. Nobody has ever, that I'm aware of, dropped a pencil and had it fall to the ceiling, unless you're in an upside down house. So,
well, I've got this phone here, this smartphone, and somehow I keep butt dialing on it. Explain that one to me.
yeah.
Weird things do happen, but there's a reason.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Rehoboam, son of Solomon, was king in Judah. He was 41 years old when he became king, which means he was born about the time, maybe a year before, his father became king after David. And he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city the Lord had chosen from among all the tribes of Israel as the place to honor his name. Rehoboam's mother was Naamah, an Ammonite woman. Now, I have suggested before that when it names a king's mother, it means she held the position of queen mother. Now, of course, we know already who Solomon's mother was, but at some point she is specifically named. And the book of Kings tells us that Solomon brought in a throne and had her sit next to him. So he sort of established this position of queen mother. Rehoboam followed suit and made his mother, Naamah, the queen mother. Now notice, he was 41 years old when he became king. He reigned 17 years. You add that up, that's 58. Just so you'll be aware. During Rehoboam's reign, the people of Judah did what was evil in the Lord's sight, provoking his anger with their sin, for it was even worse than that of their ancestors. For they also built for themselves pagan shrines and set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There were even male and female shrine prostitutes throughout the land. The people imitated the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam's reign, King Shishak of Egypt came up and attacked Jerusalem. He ransacked the treasury of the Lord's temple and the royal palace. He stole everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. King Rehoboam later replaced them with bronze shields as substitutes, and he entrusted them to the care of the commanders of the guard who protected the entrance to the royal palace. Whenever the king went to the temple of the Lord, the guards would also take the shields and then return them to the guard room. The rest of the events in Rehoboam's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. There was constant war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Now, we read a couple of chapters earlier how Rehoboam went to make war against Israel to retain the king, to retake the kingdom for himself, and a prophet came and told him not to do it, and he didn't at that point. But it becomes pretty obvious when it says this, that there was still animosity between them, so there was war all the time between the two. When Rehoboam died, he was buried among his ancestors in the city of David. His mother was Naamah, an Ammonite woman. Then his son Abijam became the next king. Footnote B on Abijam, also known as Abijah. So, at this point, since we've read that Jeroboam ruled for 22 years, since Rehoboam's reign only lasted 17, Jeroboam's still got 5 years left. Abijam, or Abijah, began to rule over Judah in the 18th year of Jeroboam's reign in Israel. He reigned in Jerusalem 3 years. His mother was Maacah, the granddaughter of Absalom. And there's a footnote B there for that. I think they'll say the Hebrew is Abishalom. It's a variant spelling of Absalom, and they say compare the narrative in 2nd Chronicles. He committed the same sins as his father before him, and he was not faithful to the Lord his God as his ancestor David had been. But for David's sake, the Lord his God allowed his descendants to continue ruling, shining like a lamp, and he gave Abijam a son to rule after him in Jerusalem. For David had done what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, and had obeyed the Lord's commands throughout his life, except in the affair concerning Uriah the Hittite. There was war between Abijam and Jeroboam throughout Abijam's reign, 3 years. The rest of the events in Abijam's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. There was constant war between Abijam and Jeroboam. When Abijam died, he was buried in the city of David. Then his son Asa became the next king. Jeroboam still has a couple of years left. So it says now, Asa began to rule over Judah in the 20th year of Jeroboam's reign in Israel. He reigned in Jerusalem 41 years. His grandmother was Maacah, the granddaughter of Absalom. Now that's interesting, because I've suggested that when it names a mother, it's naming the person who held the position of queen mother. And Asa didn't make his mother queen mother. He left his grandmother, his dad's mother, in the place, so it names her here. Asa did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, as his ancestor David had done. He banished the male and female shrine prostitutes from the land and got rid of all the idols his ancestors had made. Footnote after idols. The Hebrew term literally round things probably alludes to dung. All right. He even deposed his grandmother Maacah from her position as queen mother because she had made an obscene Asherah pole. He cut down her obscene pole and burned it in the Kidron Valley. Now, we've talked about the Kidron Valley. That's the valley between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. And it was the place that in Jesus' day was also called the Valley of Ben Hinnom. And therefore the term Gehenna, or the place of burning, because it had become the Jerusalem city dump, where they burned all their trash. Which, by the way, we read a reference to burning trash a little bit earlier in this narrative. Although the pagan shrines were not removed, Asa's heart remained completely faithful to the Lord throughout his life. He brought into the temple of the Lord the silver and gold and the various items that he and his father had dedicated. There was constant war between King Asa of Judah and King Baasha of Israel. King Baasha of Israel invaded Judah and fortified Ramah in order to prevent anyone from entering or leaving King Asa's territory in Judah. Now, we haven't read about Baasha yet. We'll get to him. But he mentions him here because of his relationship, adversarial relationship between him and King Asa. Asa responded by removing all the silver and gold that was left in the treasuries of the temple of the Lord and the royal palace. He sent it with some of his officials to Ben-Hadad, son of Tabrimon, son of Hezion, the king of Aram, who was ruling in Damascus, along with this message. Oh, this sounds like bad news. Let there be a treaty between you and me, like the one between your father and my father. See, I am sending you a gift of silver and gold. Break your treaty with King Baasha of Israel so that he will leave me alone. Ben-Hadad agreed to King Asa's request and sent the commanders of his army to attack the towns of Israel. They conquered the towns of Ijon, Dan, Abel-Beth-Maachah, and all Kinnereth, and all the land of Naphtali. As soon as Baasha of Israel heard what was happening, he abandoned his project of fortifying Ramah and withdrew to Tirzah. Then King Asa sent an order throughout Judah requiring that everyone without exception help to carry away the building stones and timbers that Baasha had been using to fortify Ramah. Asa used these materials to fortify the town of Geba in Benjamin and the town of Mizpah. Now, notice that through most of this, the author just tells us what happened and doesn't say a whole lot about whether this was good or bad. He does mention the good that Asa did at the beginning in trying to eliminate some of the false worship that invaded his country. But then it just tells what he did, whether good or bad, this is what he did. The rest of the events in Asa's reign, the extent of his power, everything he did, and the names of the cities he built are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. In his old age, his feet became diseased. When Asa died, he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. Then Jehoshaphat, Asa's son, became the next king. Now, what didn't happen here, I didn't see any, it does say, he reigned in Jerusalem 41 years. So up until this time, it's possible that Saul reigned 42 years, David reigned 40, Solomon reigned 40, and again, those may be round numbers. Now they're assigning 41 to Asa's reign. So Asa's grandfather, Rehoboam, had a relatively short reign of only 17 years. And then Solomon's grandson, Rehoboam's son, Abijah, ruled for only 3 years. And then Asa took over. Now, I have in the past, and I'm not going to try to do it again because it's a difficult task and everybody has a different idea of how to make the numbers come out. When I was a child, my dad went to school at what was then Emmanuel Missionary College. And one of his professors was Edwin Thiele. And I have it in the back of my head that at one point I went to class with my dad and actually met this Edwin Thiele. At any rate, Edwin Thiele did a lot of work on this issue, and he wrote the book entitled it The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. I have not read the book. I have read some summaries. He goes through a lot of things trying to make the numbers add up right, because otherwise, if you just add them up, they don't match the story. And that's to be understood, I think. But at any rate, he goes to things like year of accession, how they marked the length of their reign. Did they start with accession year, or did they start with the first full year after they took the throne? The different kings would do different things at different times. There were also occasional co-regencies. I think you'll find that there was a co-regency between Asa and Jehoshaphat, which we'll read down here at the bottom, because it says that in his old age, his feet became diseased. So he was not able to do all the roles of the king. So he remained the king, but his son also served and did a lot of the duties of the king that his father couldn't do. So their reigns overlapped. And if you do that and you know where to do those things, you can kind of make the numbers come out. Like I say, I went through at one point and tried to draw out a chart which shows when each king, kind of like a number line. Here's the kings of Israel, here's the kings of Judah, and try and line them up. It's very hard to do. There is a point that will arrive in the history a little bit later. That'll actually be in the book of 2 Kings, where we can link the two very directly, because both kings died at the same time. So we can link that event together. But it's difficult to do, and it's even more difficult to do with any level of certainty because of the uncertainty of all the things that are going on there. So I don't think we'll bother. So we have covered the 41 years of Asa's reign. So now we're past the time when Jeroboam ruled, and we already know that Jeroboam's son Nadab took over when his father died. Nadab, son of Jeroboam, began to rule over Israel in the 2nd year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in Israel 2 years. But he did what was evil in the Lord's sight and followed the example of his father, continuing the sins that Jeroboam had led Israel to commit. Well, not a big surprise. He probably feared, like his dad, what would happen if the people returned to Jerusalem. So he maintained those gold calves. Then Baasha, son of Ahijah, from the tribe of Issachar, plotted against Nadab and assassinated him while he and the Israelite army were laying siege to the Philistine town of Gibbethon. Baasha killed Nadab in the 3rd year of King Asa's reign in Judah, and he became the next king of Israel. And this is a phenomenon we're going to see multiple times in the nation of Israel. Kill the king? Well, now you get to be the king. That's a pretty powerful incentive to murder, I'd say. And we're going to see that it happened quite a bit. So, Baasha kills Nadab and becomes king in his place. He immediately slaughtered all the descendants of King Jeroboam, so that not one of the royal family was left, just as the Lord had promised concerning Jeroboam by the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh. And then the prophet inserts his opinion. This was done because Jeroboam had provoked the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by the sins he had committed and the sins he led Israel to commit. Well, when you step outside of God's plan for life, bad things are going to happen. It's not God doing them, it's just the natural result of the choices that you make. Jeroboam made some negative choices, and there were negative results. And one of them was to open the door to broken people like Baasha, deciding to make himself king, and then to be sure that nobody from Jeroboam's family would seek to murder him to take the kingdom back. He instantly assassinates the entire family, bloodshed in the extreme. Well, that's the broken human condition. Evil leads to more evil, leads to grosser evil, leads to abominable, unbelievable evil. And it does happen when we step outside of God's plan. The rest of the events in Nadab's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. There was constant war between King Asa of Judah and King Baasha of Israel. Baasha, son of Ahijah, began to rule over all Israel in the 3rd year of King Asa's reign in Judah. Baasha reigned in Tirzah 24 years. So that's 27 of King Asa's 41 years. But he did what was evil in the Lord's sight and followed the example of Jeroboam, continuing the sins that Jeroboam had led Israel to commit. So nobody's improving anything, nobody's getting any better. And indeed, as we have suggested, they're getting a lot worse, and there's a lot of bloodshed as a result. Chapter 16. This message from the Lord was delivered to King Baasha by the prophet Jehu, son of Hanani. Now, this is not the same Jehu we'll read about later. This is a different one. I lifted you out of the dust to make you ruler of my people Israel. Well, he did it himself, but okay. God's going to take credit for it because that's how the Hebrew people think, and that's how he can relate to them. But you have followed the evil example of Jeroboam. You have provoked my anger by causing my people to sin. So now I will destroy you and your family, just as I destroyed the descendants of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. The members of Baasha's family who die in the city will be eaten by dogs, and those who die in the field will be eaten by vultures. The exact same thing that was said about Jeroboam's family. The rest of the events in Baasha's reign and the extent of his power are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. When Baasha died, he was buried in Tirzah. Then his son Elah became the next king.
How is this talking about how Jesus loved them?
It isn't, is it?
So why are we going over it?
It's talking about what happens when people live outside of God's plan.
Oh, okay.
And it's there, it's recorded.
Okay.
The rest of the events in Baasha's reign and okay, we just read that. The message from the Lord against Baasha and his family came through the prophet Jehu, son of Hanani. It was delivered because Baasha had done what was evil in the Lord's sight, just as the family of Jeroboam had done, and also because Baasha had destroyed the family of Jeroboam. The Lord's anger was provoked by Baasha's sins. Well, yes, if you see people being killed for no reason at all, and you don't become angry, there's something wrong with your level of righteousness. So yes, the Lord's anger was provoked. Now, what the Lord does in his wrath reminds us of what Paul said, in your anger do not sin. Elah, son of Baasha, began to rule over Israel in the 26th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in the city of Tirzah for 2 years. Then Zimri, who commanded half the royal chariots, made plans to kill him. One day in Tirzah, Elah was getting drunk at the home of Arza, the supervisor of the palace. Well, he's the king. He can do what he wants. If he wants to get drunk, who's going to say anything about it? Well, apparently Zimri. Zimri walked in and struck him down and killed him. This happened in the 27th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. Then Zimri became the next king. Zimri is going to follow the example of Baasha. Zimri immediately killed the entire royal family of Baasha, leaving him not even a single male child, so nobody would have a reason to usurp Zimri's reign by claiming that they were descended from Baasha. He even destroyed distant relatives and friends. No, this is political executions, very clearly. So Zimri destroyed the dynasty of Baasha as the Lord had promised through the prophet Jehu. Not necessarily promised, but foretold. This happened because of all the sins Baasha and his son Elah had committed. This is the this is the author trying to make sense of what's going on when they believe that if it happened, God did it. So why did God do this? Well, it must be because of this. They provoked the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, with their worthless idols. The rest of the events in Elah's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. Zimri began to rule over Israel in the 27th year of King Asa's reign in Judah, but his reign in Tirzah lasted only 7 days. The army of Israel was then attacking the Philistine town of Gibbethon. When they heard that Zimri had committed treason and had assassinated the king, that very day they chose Omri, commander of the army, as the new king of Israel. So Omri led the entire army of Israel up from Gibbethon to attack Tirzah, Israel's capital. When Zimri saw that the city had been taken, he went into the citadel of the palace and burned it down over himself and died in the flames. Again, the writer's opinion. For he too had done what was evil in the Lord's sight. He followed the example of Jeroboam and all the sins he had committed and led Israel to commit. So, Zimri lasts just a few days before Omri says, oh, wait a minute, this is wrong. We can't let you become king. And in this case, Omri did not assassinate Zimri. He did attack, but then Zimri committed suicide. But now the people of Israel were split into two factions. Half the people tried to make Tibni, son of Ginath, their king, while the other half supported Omri. But Omri's supporters defeated the supporters of Tibni. So Tibni was killed and Omri became the next king. We're talking sub-third world country politics at this point. I mean, the instability of the government of the Northern Kingdom at this point is just off the charts. Jeroboam's son is murdered. His murderer then kills all of Jeroboam's family. Then his son gets killed by Zimri. Zimri dies when Omri takes over. Then Omri and Tibni have a civil war in order for Omri to become king. Tibni was killed in all of this. So it says now that Omri began to rule over Israel in the 31st year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned 12 years in all, 6 of them in Tirzah. Then Omri built the hill now known as Samaria from its owner Shemer for 150 pounds of silver. He built a city on it and called the city Samaria in honor of Shemer. So now we're going to see the capital of Israel move from Tirzah to Samaria, and that will be its capital from there on out. And it is how the people in Jesus' day were known as Samaritans. They were the people of Samaria, the capital of their kingdom. And Omri is the one who did this during his 12-year reign. But it says, Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. He followed the example of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and all the sins he had committed and led Israel to commit. The people provoked the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, with their worthless idols. The rest of the events in Omri's reign, the extent of his power, and everything he did, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. When Omri died, he was buried in Samaria. Then his son, here's a familiar name, Ahab, became the next king. Now, Ahab is going to introduce a bit of political stability, but it's going to be exceptionally problematic if you're familiar with the story of Israel and the story of King Ahab. Ahab, son of Omri, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. Now, that doesn't add up. It says back here that Omri began to rule over Israel in the 31st year of King Asa. He reigned 12 years in all. And yet, when Ahab becomes king, it is the 38th year. That's only 7. So apparently, Ahab and Omri had a 5-year co-regency. That's what appears to be the case here. As I say, the numbers don't add up. He reigned in Samaria 22 years. But Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. And as though it were not enough to follow the sinful example of Jeroboam, he married Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and he began to bow down in worship of Baal. First, Ahab built a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. Then he set up an Asherah pole. He did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the other kings of Israel before him. He's kind of pulling out all the stops here. It was during his reign that Hiel, a man from Bethel, rebuilt Jericho. Now, this is going to refer back to something we read way back in the book of Joshua. When he laid its foundations, it cost him the life of his oldest son, Abiram. And when he completed it and set up its gates, it cost him the life of his youngest son, Segub. This all happened according to the message from the Lord concerning Jericho, spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. Footnote B for that Segub. An ancient Hebrew scribal tradition reads, he killed his oldest son when he laid its foundations, and he killed his youngest son when he set up its gates. Don't know why he would do that, but then given all the killing that's been going on in this story, we can't say that's not what happened. Moving on to chapter 17. Now we get into stories of the prophets of Israel. Now Elijah, who was from Tishbe in Gilead, told King Ahab, now remember Gilead is part of the Transjordan territory, told King Ahab, as surely as the Lord the God of Israel lives, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word. Now, some people like to dramatize this a bit, because who was Elijah? He was apparently unknown up to this point, and so they imagine this rural person striding into the palace where he doesn't belong and delivering this very negative message to the king, and then turning around and marching out. And then verse 2 tells us, then the Lord said to Elijah, go to the east and hide by Kerith Brook, near where it enters the Jordan River. Drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I have commanded them to bring you food. So he's delivered this message. It's certainly not pleasing to Ahab, who's wicked and who didn't want to have anything to do with Yahweh. And now Yahweh is saying, ain't going to rain till I say so. And, well, what business do you have? And so he may well have sent people to search for Elijah. So Elijah went and hid according to the directions given him. So Elijah did as the Lord told him and camped beside Kerith Brook east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. But after a while, the brook dried up. Well, there's no rain. If there's no rain, the creeks and brooks and rivers are over time going to dry up. For there was no rainfall anywhere in the land. Now we're dealing with drought. Then the Lord said to Elijah, go and live in the village of Zarephath near the city of Sidon. Now this is interesting because the wicked queen of Israel, one Jezebel, wife of Ahab, is Sidonian royalty. Now, God's telling Elijah, go live in the city of Jezebel's heritage. Well, not in the city, but in the country. It's a village, so it's not a big town. So Elijah goes there as instructed. And God tells him, I have instructed a widow there to feed you. Except we have no record that that instruction came from anybody but Elijah. At any rate, so he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, would you please bring me a little water in a cup? As she was going to get it, he called to her, bring me a bite of bread too. But she said, I swear by the Lord your God, and notice she's using the tetragrammaton Yahweh. If she's calling him your God, because you're an Israelite, God isn't the God of Sidon, he's the God of Israel. I swear by Yahweh your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal. Then my son and I will die. But Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you said, but make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. For this is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and oil, olive oil, left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. Sometime later, the woman's son became sick. He grew worse and worse, and finally he died. And then she said to Elijah, oh man of God, what have you done to me? Oh great, I have to reload this. It runs into that every once. I think it's the advertising they're trying to throw at us that gets stuck. So now her son dies and she's quick to blame Elijah. Oh man of God, what have you done to me? Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son? We may be seeing a guilty conscience here. She's astounded at the benefit she's receiving. She's a widow. She didn't have a way to make a living. She's only got a little bit of flour and oil, but the man of God shows up and all of a sudden there's just, every time she goes to get flour and oil, there's flour and oil in the containers. And she continues to bake bread, and they continue to have food to eat. But then her son dies. Well, maybe you can understand that odd things have happened, and she might indeed, in her grief, and in one of the stages of grief is rage. In her rage, blame Elijah. But Elijah replied, give me your son. And he took the child's body from her arms, carried him up the stairs to the room where he was staying, and laid the body on his bed. Then Elijah cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, why have you brought tragedy to this widow who has opened her home to me, causing her son to die? Apparently Elijah himself has problems in understanding who God is, as we will see as we read on. And he stretched himself out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him. The Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he revived. Then Elijah brought him down from the upper room and gave him to his mother. "Look," he said, "your son is alive." And then the woman told Elijah, "Now I know for sure that you are a man of God, and that God truly speaks through you." So this chapter really takes a major turn in the narrative. All of a sudden, it's like we're reading an entirely different book. It's like up until now we've been reading the story of assassinations and political instability and people acting horribly. And then all of a sudden, we switch gears. We have a prophet of God show up, and we have miracles taking place. What appear to us humans to be mystical events. We don't believe they're mystical. We believe they're founded in reality, because God is very real, so he is a God of reality. So let's move on then. Later on, in the 3rd year of the drought, the Lord said to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain." So Elijah went to appear before Ahab. Meanwhile, the famine had become very severe in Samaria. We're in the 3rd year of the drought. There's not much left. So Ahab summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of the palace. Obadiah was a devoted follower of Yahweh. Once, when Jezebel had tried to kill all the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had hidden 100 of them in 2 caves. He put 50 prophets in each cave and supplied them with food and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, "We must check every spring and valley in the land to see if we can find enough grass to save at least some of my horses and mules." And this is royal thinking at its worst. If there's anything good in the land that belongs to the king, he's going to take it by force if necessary. So they divided the land between them. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went another way by himself. As Obadiah was walking along, he suddenly saw Elijah coming toward him. Obadiah recognized him at once and bowed low to the ground before him. "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" he asked. Now this says to us that Obadiah recognized Elijah as a prophet of God, not one of the ones he had saved, but a prophet of God nonetheless, and as a sincere follower of Yahweh. He recognizes the status of the person before him, and he shows him obeisance, actually. "Yes, it is," Elijah replied. "Now go and tell your master Elijah is here." And now we see the nature of living in a dictatorship, because let's face it, that's what Israel was at this point. With Ahab in charge, he ran things the way he wanted. Everybody had to do what he said. And so even Obadiah now has succumbed to the fear of living in that kind of regime. "Oh, sir," Obadiah protested, "what harm have I done to you that you're sending me to my death at the hands of Ahab? For I swear by the Lord your God that the king has searched every nation and kingdom on earth from end to end to find you. And each time he was told, 'Elijah isn't here.' King Ahab forced the king of that nation to swear to the truth of his claim. And now you say, 'Go and tell your master Elijah is here.' But as soon as I leave you, the Spirit of the Lord will carry you away to who knows where. When Ahab comes and cannot find you, he will kill me. Yet I have been a true servant of the Lord all my life. Has no one told you, my Lord, about the time when Jezebel was trying to kill the Lord's prophet? I hid 100 of them in 2 caves and supplied them with food and water. And now you say, 'Go and tell your master Elijah is here.' Sir, if I do that, Ahab will certainly kill me. Okay. A fearful man because he lived in fearful times. And perhaps it is right for him to be cautious here. But Elijah said, I swear by Yahweh El Shaddai, the Lord Almighty, in whose presence I stand, that I will present myself to Ahab this very day. So Obadiah went to tell Ahab that Elijah had come, and Ahab went out to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw him, he exclaimed, So is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel? What were we saying about people blaming other people for their own malfeasance? To the extent that there can be blame assigned for this drought, the blame would fall on Ahab for the sins that he's caused Israel to commit, leading God to give them what they want and to abandon them to the natural consequences of whatever's going on, hence a drought. I have made no trouble for Israel, Elijah replied. You and your family are the troublemakers, for you have refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. Now, summon all Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who are supported by Jezebel. Or, what's the footnote say? Who eat at Jezebel's table. Well, yeah, essentially the same meaning there. So, we're going to have 850 prophets of false gods, and we're going to have Elijah. And they're going to meet with the people at Mount Carmel. And for whatever reason, Ahab does what Elijah suggests. And he calls all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, How much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. But the people were completely silent. Notice he's giving them a choice. He's not telling them what they have to do. He says, it's time for you to make up your minds. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only prophet of Yahweh who is left. But Baal has 450 prophets. Now, bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish, and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahweh, the God who answers by fire. By setting fire to the wood is the true God. And all the people agreed. So now Elijah set up a test. It's to be a demonstration of who is and who isn't truly a worshipable deity. And the people have agreed to his test. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood. So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. They called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "Oh, Baal, answer us!" But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. Big show now. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. And I'm going to suggest this is a choice Elijah has made, and not necessarily, in fact, almost certainly not something God has commanded him to do. And we're going to see the results of him misbehaving in this way. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed, "for surely he is a god. Perhaps he's daydreaming, or is relieving himself." Let's see what footnote B says there. Or busy somewhere else, or is engaged in business. But most translations do render that relieving himself. Or maybe he is away on a trip, or is asleep and needs to be awakened. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound, no reply, no response. Now, there are people who tell this story who imagine that Elijah had to keep close watch so that these, 850 prophets, although primarily it's the 450 prophets of Baal that are part of this demonstration, don't sneak a fire into the wood and then say, "See, our God kindled the fire." He had to make sure that didn't happen. Given human nature, I'd say that's a very real possibility. Then Elijah called to the people, "Come over here." They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of Yahweh that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel. Footnote C, each of the tribes of the sons of Jacob to whom the Lord had said, "Your name will be Israel." All right. I kind of lost my place. Here we are. And used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of Yahweh. Then he dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. Footnotes there, D and E. 2 seahs, or about 14.6 liters of seed. And then in verse 1834 in the Hebrew text begins here. Well, what-de-do. I'm not too worried about the Hebrew numbering, because the numbering is all after the fact anyway. And then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour the water over the offering and the wood." After they had done this, he said, "Do the same thing again." And when they were finished, he said, "Now do it a 3rd time." So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Yahweh, are God and that you have brought them back to yourself." Immediately the fire of Yahweh flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. This is the fire of the Lord. It is not the fire that we're used to. The fire that we're used to would be quenched by all the water. The water would prevent the fire from kindling the wood or the sacrifice. But in this case, the fire takes the bull, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench.
You cannot see the fire of passion. You can see the result.
Yes. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, He is God." Yes, Yahweh is God. Then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape." So the people seized them all, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley and killed them there. Well, now Elijah is succumbing to the approach of the times. If you defeat somebody, you have to kill them so they don't take over. So he shows no mercy. He is not reflecting the character of God in this action, and it will come back to haunt him. So all these 450 prophets of Baal and possibly the 400 prophets of Ashtoreth. Then Elijah said to Ahab, "Go and get something to eat and drink, for I hear a mighty rainstorm coming." So Ahab went to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and bowed low to the ground and prayed with his face between his knees. And then he said to his servant, "Go and look out toward the sea." The servant went and looked and returned to Elijah and said, "I don't see anything." 7 times Elijah told him to go and look. Finally, the 7th time his servant told him, "I see a little cloud about the size of a man's hand rising from the sea." Then Elijah shouted, "Hurry to Ahab and tell him, 'Climb into your chariot and go back home. If you don't hurry, the rain will stop you.'" And soon the sky was black with clouds. A heavy wind brought a terrific rainstorm, and Ahab left quickly for Jezreel. Then the Lord gave special strength to Elijah. He tucked his cloak into his belt and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to the entrance of Jezreel. Now let's just ponder that little bit about the 7 trips of Elijah's servant. We have no idea who this servant was. We know he isn't because Elisha hasn't been called yet. And in Mendelssohn's oratorio Elijah, he assigns the part of the servant to a boy singer. So a boy soprano essentially comes to sing the part. There is nothing, the sky is bare. But there's nothing that says this servant was a boy. In fact, it's weird because we haven't read about a servant until just now. But what's going on here with this 7 trips? God had already said he was going to send rain. Does Elijah think he has to make it happen? And perhaps because of that, that is why God is making him wait. You need to wait until you recognize that it is Yahweh, not Elijah, who will bring the rain. However, when Elijah hears about that little cloud, tiny little cloud rising up out of the sea, Elijah recognizes that now Yahweh is acting. There's going to be rain. There's going to be a lot of rain. We need to get off the mountain. And so they get off the mountain. And I'm seeing here that our time is pretty much up, and since we're at the end of a chapter, though clearly not the end of this story, but there's a lot more to this story. So, yes, it's hung up on me again. I'm not even going to bother with it because we're done reading. We will have to return next week to continue the story of Elijah and of Ahab, Jezebel, the people of Israel, and all the other things that go on in this story. So, since we've come to this ending, we invite you to join us again next week as we continue the story. And until then, we say goodbye and God bless.